Hey, what is happening? I am so excited to show you this. I've been working with the great guys over at Shaper Tools to create a whole new realm of working with thin veneers and the Shaper origin. It's taken me months to figure out how to incorporate this fragile material we call raw veneer or commercial veneer with the Shaper origin, and this video will show you exactly how to do that. I'll be offering veneer packs off my website, like this domestic kit. I also have a domestic and exotic with beautiful species and grain patterns. And this particular project that will be available through ShaperHub featuring these incredibly beautiful dyed veneers. With this new knowledge and skill set, you'll be able to create your own spectacular motifs. All right, let's get started. I wanted a solid and flat area, and I have this white countertop that typically sets over this machine, and it's the perfect space. I thought about using the Shaper workstation, but the footprint's a little bit small, and I'm going to be pressing down pretty hard to get these veneers to stay put. Right here is a break between two pieces of 1/4" MDF, and underneath the piece with the Shaper tape is another layer of veneer. This was all held down with something called Easy Tack, and I'll show you that in a bit. And then in front of that is where I can cut the veneer, which means the top of that veneer that's being cut and the top of the Shaper tape will be the same level or plane. On the wall to my left is where I keep my original drawing just as a reference. I also have this pair of switch outlets. The left one activates the vacuum, and the right side activates the switch for the origin, so I don't have to go through the anguish of plugging and unplugging it. Real quick, so these few items are the key to your success. Easy Tack, a roller, and a painter's spatula. So this is how I use the Easy Tack. First of all, we need to get this Shaper origin out of the way. We don't want to get overspray on that. In addition, I use a piece of cardboard to shield the domino tape, because anywhere any of this overspray or residual gets, it's going to be tacky. And I'm going to go ahead and use some of this cross grain veneer just to show you how well this stuff works. And to apply it, it's kind of like putting a light coat of, rattle can spray paint. It's hard to see, so you just have to kind of visualize that amount. It doesn't take much. And we're only spraying the substrate, not the veneer. We're going to let this set for a couple of minutes. And the type of material that you use for your wasteboard will probably also make a difference. Here I'm using MDF, and it works fantastic with the Easy Tack. A couple of rollers, one with wood and metal, all metal. They're just simple wallpaper rollers, right? Of course, you want to start in the middle and work out just like anything else. Doesn't take much, and you can test it. Make sure it's down enough. Feels about right. And then these dudes, spatulas, painter's spatulas, this is what you're going to get underneath that veneer. So you can see that this is cross grain. Normally it would be pretty fragile and break pretty easy, right? But with one of these guys, you can kind of work it like that. How awesome is that? All right, let's continue. All right, we're gonna go ahead and put a first piece down, and I have a center mark on here. You may use it, you may not, but it's might be handy to have. I've put a small mark on this piece, also center of the piece. Not always going to use a grid off the edge, but that's another option. Anyway, a pencil like this is pretty handy. This is like a white graphite made by Boheen, and that's how I'm marking that. And you'll notice I didn't go all the way across the black because this white could get into the grain and be hard to get out. Anyway, I'm just gonna put this somewhere in there. Nothing too critical. Something like that. And you don't want to spray this, you want to spray your wasteboard, because if you spray this, it could impede, when you're actually gluing this to your substrate. It probably wouldn't hurt anything because it's a really light mist, but I just go ahead and spray this guy. I figured out this easy tack with another Shaper Origin project called Logo Inlay. I'll leave a link in the description. Oh, incidentally, some of these veneers are going to be a little bit wavy, a little bit wrinkled. If they're really severe, you'll have to flatten those. I have an awesome YouTube video on the simple process. These here, they're small enough, and I think they'll be fine. We want this to tack down and, you know, not move, of course. We don't want any bubbles in it, but we also need to be able to remove it later. So, yeah, not enough. Maybe I was talking too much. I did realize that initially it'll take more glue, and then as you cut more and more pieces, of course the glue will start to build up a little bit and it'll require less glue. So something to think about. As with anything else, you start in the middle and work out. In the description, I'll have a short list, but absolutely necessary items that you'll need when incorporating veneer with a Shaper Origin. And that's it. So when the machine does a X or a Z calibration, this is all one beautiful level playing field, yeah? So I'm scanning in the workspace, and a cool tip or trick that Sean showed me is to go ahead and scan your piece that you're cutting, because this is the time that the camera can see it, which allows you to put the file exactly where you want it and also take advantage of that grain and integrate that into the scene. Okay, and so here is one way to do it without making a grid. You can see I've loaded that file and I can put it in place, and you can see that I can put this right at the edge of my piece. Since I scanned my piece in, it's right there. So I can just place that, something like that, and boom. Zoom out a little bit, and you can see the top of the file there. I went ahead and scooted it over to the right side, but you don't always have to use a grid. Sometimes it's just easier not to. All right, so this raw or commercial veneer is 1/42 of an inch thick veneer. If we take a set of dial calipers, 22, about 23 thousandths, depends on where you measure it. That's just something good to know. However, if you remember elementary or whenever we learned about fractions and decimal equivalents, let me get this to where it shows here and bring this calculator up. So 1/42, so we're going to take 1 divided by 42. Boom. 0.023, 23 thousandths. And of course, the Shaper Origin will accept decimals or fractions, or you can combine fractions and decimals within the Origin calculator. We need to know that so we can set our depth. Now, I like to think in terms of sheets of paper. Sheets of paper are about 4 thousandths. So we're going to set our depth here. Depth, we're going to go in. We're going to go a little deeper. We don't want to go too deep and cut into the wasteboard, but we definitely want to cut through the veneer. So I'm going to go 0.032, 32 thousandths. And later I adjusted this to 26 thousandths, 0.026. Then once we hover on the file, you can see outside of cut, which is what we want. Now we need an offset. This is really important. We want to be, for this type of project with veneer and cutting all these pieces, we're going to give it negative 0.002, 2 thousandths, negative 2 thousandths offset, which means it's making all the pieces slightly small. That way they fit. By the way, it's always a good idea to make some test cuts. You know, you want to make sure that everything fits. I'm telling you negative 2 thousandths offsets for all the pieces, but check for yourself. Take some of that moon piece, you know, you're going to have some extra there, make some test cuts. You'll get a feel for the way the veneer cuts. Okay, size of bit, I've already changed that. It's an 1/8 inch. Don't forget to Z-touch. Let's let that do its thing. We are ready to roll. And you'll notice I did not cut the bottom of the file on this particular piece. This black is actually the bottom of this motif. And so it just gave me a little bit of slack to do it that way. Also, I'm only making one pass to make the cut, so just making the cuts straight away. Okay, let me grab my painter's spatulas. This one I already had. I went and got this one for that last project I did. But with that, you can easily cut this veneer loose without breaking it. And even when there's cross grain slivers that are very vulnerable and fragile, you can get in there and just carefully cut that loose, yeah? When I first got that larger spatula, I took some 320 grit sandpaper and smoothed all the edges. And incidentally, where do you start? Well, when you're cutting something like this, they're essentially all just puzzle pieces, so it really doesn't matter where you begin. I decided to start at the bottom. Oh, there it is. This is fraying a little bit. I believe that my bit is probably dull, so I'm gonna go ahead and change it. I ended up switching to a 1/16 downcut spiral, and that worked so much better, less resistance. From a prior project, I had a piece of purple. I wanted to scan that in so I could take advantage of the grain. Let me show you what I mean. So here's a really good example of being able to manipulate that file and twist it and turn it till I was able to line it up with that grain. And you may already know this, but notice that I have the auto lock on. That's just a double click with the green button. And so I'm just moving steadily on the straight sections, and then I stop at the corners and allow the shaper origin to move precisely around those corners. What an incredible and fun machine. The spoil board, or the same spoil board, should be able to be used over and over for this project, but remember that small pieces can't adhere where the cuts are, so be aware of that. All right, so occasionally you're going to get a piece of veneer that splits, right? No big shake. You can decide which side you want for the front or back. This has a scratch there and some black. I don't even know what that is. I'll make this the front. So from the back side, we'll go ahead and glue that. And you can kind of separate it slightly, being careful so you don't make it worse. A little bit of glue. That's actually too much, but it's okay. Just squeegee that in there. Wipe off the excess. Pull it tight. Now it's interesting, I should note that if you have a break in a board or even in veneer and it's angled, as you pull it tight, those wedges one will go on top of the other. So just be aware of that. You can actually make it too tight, I guess, and it'll get out of alignment. So you can see how it's not quite flush. A little more tape. We'll just let that dry. All right, we're on a roll now, and it's the same process over and over. Just glue a piece down, cut the file, set the parts aside, release the fall off, and lather, rinse, repeat. Yeah. All right, at this stage, I've got files 8 and 9 cut, and then 7, which was the pink, which is outlined there. This image here was the purple. That's not really hurt anything, but this last file, I might as well get rid of that. I'm gonna get that out of there so I can just hit remove. Boom. The next file I want is shiprock. But first, we're gonna go to grid and new grid. Okay, drop the bit down, and you can see the dashed line that indicates the edge that I'm touching, and that 1 is the bit. Up here it reminds you, confirm bit size is correct, and I have a 1/4 inch shank hanging out of the collet, so 1/4 inch. Then we go to the next place, right in here somewhere, hit the green button. So you could go around the corner. I'm on the right side, and it automatically recognizes that I'm on the right side. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back, and I'm going to go to center, And this is just visually because I have a center on my wasteboard. And you can see that the dashed line is right in the center of the bit. And boom. So now you can see that grid. Now we know exactly where we're at in 3D space. Okay, with our grid in place, we can grab this file, number 6. And now you can see as I rotate the shaper origin, that file stays affixed in relation to that x-axis. Kind of cool, right? So I'm going to bring it up, and you can see if I go left and right, this x-axis changes. I'm negative 1.5 inches to the left. So I'm just going to center it. So we'll just go to 0. And somewhere in there is good. And I'll hit the place button. Okay. And now we can actually measure this precisely. So if I go here, it's like, okay, to the left, the very left extreme is, you can see that negative 4.5. If I go to the right extreme, somewhere in, I'd say there, I'm also 4.5, so it's about 9 inches wide. So the height, we can do the same thing. Boom, right there. So I'm about half an inch from this x-axis down at the bottom, half an inch. And to the very top, we're about 8 inches. So the height of that shiprock is about 7.5, and it's, what do we say, 9 inches wide. That's cool, right? So we can we know exactly where to place our veneer. It's also a good way to figure out how big of a piece of veneer you need for a particular file. Incidentally, a much simpler way, Russ with Shaper Tools reminded me that the scale function will show you the X and Y dimensions of a file when you import it, and so you don't have to probe off the grid like I did here. But hey, I'm still learning. All right, according to our grid, the top of the peak was at 8 inches. So what I did is I marked 8.5 and made a line. 8.5. Oops, that was 9.5. I was wondering why there was 2 lines. So not that guy. So 8.5, and that's going to be to the top, because what I'm trying to do is see this grain here. I want that to be part of this area right in here. That grain right in there. So center of this file was right in here somewhere. So I'm going to scoot it over just a little bit. And this is what I really enjoy. This is the fun part of just getting creative with this and the grain and everything. So somewhere in there is where I want that. So I can literally just mark that. That's where I'll spray the adhesive. And here I've moved on to the next file to cut those 5 separate pieces, the dark areas. And you may have noticed that your file numbers may not be the same as mine. I think the new ones will be revised and updated. As you're cutting all these pieces and you start to stack them up somewhere, make sure that they stay flat. They can tend to warp pretty easily. So yeah, with veneers, you always want to put a board on top, add some weight. Keep them flat, and it also keeps the relative humidity away from them. When you get a chance and you notice the large finish motif, notice the fissures in the shiprock. They come to a sharp point, and this is something that I talked about with the guys over at Shaper, and then when they created the files, they made that happen. So even though we're using a round bit, we have sharp points. Fantastic. All right, let me show you something. So I've got a couple of pieces of veneer here. You can see they're laid kind of skewed because I wanted the grain to line up. I cut this one first, and I'm picky. The grain runs off. I didn't like it, so I just copied the file and moved it over here. This one looks better. There's 4 total cactuses, so I've got 2 of them cut, and let me show you on the screen how I can copy and move that where I want. Okay, so you can see this one that's just highlighted in blue. That's the first one I cut. I got rid of the file, but the cut path I left in place, just so I would know where that's at. Here's the second one I cut, and here's that third one I cut. since I know where this previous cut path was, I know I can place that in that location. So now I can actually copy this. Actually, I can get rid of this one. Let's go to Design, highlight it, remove, and see it shows the eraser, so it gives me the option if I want to remove that cut path. I'm just going to leave it so I know it's there and I can place other files around it. So now I can copy this. And then I have this one here that I need to place. So I can move it over here, and I know I have plenty of black right below where this one was cut. I see that existing cut path, that's blue, and I can just put this right there. Boom. I can visually look where my router is cutting. Right here is to my extreme left, plenty of material at the bottom. I'm not going to run into that other piece that I cut. So this is just one option. Another option would be to add to scan. So an add to scan does two things. A, it's going to add new domino tape if it finds any, and two, it updates the image. So lots of options, just explore. You may have noticed that I made the grain on these cacti go vertical. I thought it would look better, and I knew it would be stronger. So here's a really good example of this process. So I get underneath here like this. I can start this one. This just happens to be the right amount of glue. And I can get underneath here and pivot that. And you can see how I'm focusing on getting this guy. Right? And once I get in there, I go in a little further, and then I can come back, get this one released. So you're always staying underneath the offcut and the piece you want. So you don't end up snagging it like I'm doing there. Boom, there, and I can come back and go down like that. So leaving your fall off sometimes helps. It helps keep the putty knife, or what do we call it? Spatula, down and in place. All right, this is kind of funny, but very effective. Something I do when I'm using aerosols, whether it's whatever, shellac, sometimes paint, in this case, this Easy Tack or even contact cement, it bugs me that the spray tips clog really quickly. So what I do, you can see it must have had some blue spray paint that's kind of tinted blue. So I just used a heat gun to bend this. This actually has holes in the bottom, right? Little strainer. I can get the tip that I need. Put that in place, and that's going to spray perfectly straight away. I don't have to mess with it. And these guys live in here. That can't fall over because of the handle. Lacquer thinner has a lid on it to keep it from evaporating. And that works for me. Right in there. The bigger the piece, the flatter it needs to be, I guess. The more stubborn it can be. I'm gonna start in the middle and roll it out. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll load the file, kind of get an idea of where it's going to cut, and then press it down in those areas. I mean, press it down better in those areas, yeah. So that the perimeter or outside of the file isn't, you know, crazy adhered. All right, so I goofed. I put the file too high. So, and I have all this extra that would just get thrown away, right? Because I just need this piece, the sky. No big shake. So we're gonna make a seam here, cut this piece off, seam this edge, stitch that back together, and then we'll have plenty. This may be something that you need to do anyway, so let me show you how I do that. So I cut it loose here and here. And of course, keep in mind which piece you need. These sharp points are pretty vulnerable, but they're not cross-grained, so you should be fine. This right here will want to crack going across that vulnerable cross-grain, as it will here and anywhere in here. So just really watch those cross-grain areas. And I could actually just cut this because this is all I need to make it easier. That dude will go up there. And I did pretty good, except for one area here came loose. So since this is cross grain, you can see that I don't want to start here and try to pull that up. It'll probably just crack again. I want to come in on this end or on this end. And hey, I know I'm being a little redundant on some of these topics, but these are areas that you'll probably have problems with. So I just want to make sure you understand the importance here. Okay, here we are at my table saw, and an ideal way to cut these veneers straight would be with something like this. This is what I call my veneer sled, and the way it works is, you can see it's similar construction to a crosscut sled. However, rather than riding in the miter gauge slots, which are just too short for this application, I use a straight edge, but a long one. I have these in different lengths, and I have a 9-footer. And so with my 9-footer, I first get it straight with the fence. I have a hole drilled in it. It anchors down here with a machine bolt. I clamp the other end, and then this sled has these 2 plastic runners, and those go over that straight edge, right? And with that creates a long, sliding and accurate movement. But I'm going to assume that you don't have one of these, or a slider would also be a good option, but let's just pretend you don't have one of those. Hopefully you have a table saw, and that's how we're going to make these cuts. All right, so I found a chunk of melamine. It's 3/4, and it's wider than this main piece, right? And we're going to make a seam here, and we're going to make a seam on this piece. So we can flip it upside down. We just need to line those up and tape those in place just so they don't shift. Then we can use Easy Tack to hold this in place. I'm just going to put it close to that edge. This has been sprayed, and boom. Put a couple more pieces here just so those don't move. Then we'll run this edge. Incidentally, I checked this edge, so make sure your edge that's going against the fence is straight. And then we'll simply put the saw on about 12 1/8, right? Make the cut. I'm going to grab one more board to put on top. Now I need to raise the blade. Oh, it'll just be maybe a 1/16 above that top veneer. This guy lives right there. Okay, and then we can set the fence at 12 1/8. Now this blade is it's actually a rip blade, but it's a quality rip blade. It's a Forest with an ATB grind. I love that blade. Very universal. So we've got a sacrificial board. This guy will go down on top of here, and I could hold it by hand, but I'm going to anchor that with a couple of screws. Please continue to hold. So I've pre-drilled this. We'll put this right there. One over here. It's not really necessary, but it'll look safer on video. Of course, the goal here is to provide zero clearance situation around the blade, top and bottom, for perfect glue-ready seams. This is actually good to know how to do because maybe your veneer isn't wide enough. If you're seaming it with the grain, super simple. Let's see, this guy actually goes, this guy or this sky? I'm a dork. Yeah, like that. And this one went like that. That's going to be beautiful. All right, with two pieces that seam together perfectly, we'll begin taping across the seam from the front side. Yeah. Use a roller to make sure that tape has adhered. Now that that seam is tight, we'll use one full piece of tape with the seam, and this serves two purposes. A, it keeps the adjoining veneers flush to each other, and two, it keeps the glue from coming through the front. So this process of taping seams or joining seams is always the same. You tape across the seam from the front, one long piece with the seam, and then stretch more tape across the seam from the back till it's no longer buckling. Then make absolutely sure that the two pieces are flush, and then we wait a bit. We're always learning, right? And I love that fact. So going back to my old Formica days, heat up that knife or spatula, right? And that'll cut right through that glue. Check it out. Of course, I'm being ultra careful here. I may have applied too much glue or maybe too much pressure, but I need to carefully cut those loose. Yeah, so years ago, working with Formica, there were times we'd have to go into an older home and remove the countertops. And back then, they would actually adhere the substrate down to the cabinets and then Formica over that. And sometimes they would use screws. Well, without destroying the cabinets, it was impossible to lift those countertops off. So I discovered that using heat, it would soften the contact cement and allow us to remove the Formica without tearing things up. Bit of a side note, sometime after that, I realized I could just find those screws with a magnet, remove the Formica in those areas, remove the screws, and those tops would just come right up. Always learning, yeah? All right, with all the pieces cut, we can start assembling. Exciting, right? And this thing is just like a puzzle. However, we need to deburr some of these pieces. It doesn't take much, 180 grit, and just go through them. Take it all off, take off all those little burrs. You're gonna notice that on some of this cross grain, let's see, I already did that one. On this cross grain cut, it creates a little bit of a burr. On this long grain, it's fine. So, just take that off, especially on the back, both sides really, but it comes off easily. Or you can make something like this. Yeah, it's interesting the way the cutter reacts with different grain. Anyway, deburr. All right, here's a little tip for you. Sandpaper, I just cut it in half, right? Sprayed a little of that easy tack back to back, and we'll just stick those together, right? And I'm actually surprised that manufacturers don't sell it like this to begin with. It makes it easier to use, it stiffens it up, and when you're using it, instead of your hand sliding across the smooth surface, because one side's rough and one side is smooth, it just sticks to your hand, sticks to your fingers. So yeah, and then from there I can cut it into smaller pieces. Okay, so there's a couple of ways to glue these pieces all in place. The first method, and I'm making this twice because a friend saw it and they wanted one. That's going to happen. Anyway, so this first one, I went ahead and started at the top and I started gluing all these pieces in place. That's one way to do it. You have to be careful though, because of a couple of things. A, as you're putting glue, you're introducing moisture. The veneer pieces might start to warp a little bit. And as you're pulling those pieces tight, the entire motif or image can start to distort a little bit. You can see it gets a little bit of a buckle. I can work with that. I have the experience to deal with that. But if you're just starting out, I would probably advise you to do it this other method, and I'll show you that in a bit. So essentially, with this method, I just glue all the pieces together like a puzzle. I'm stitching them as I go and work all the way down. I've got a couple of pieces to put in here. But so that's one way to do it. I should add that this is glued, taped, and assembled from the front. And then once that dries, you remove the tape and it's ready to adhere to a substrate. The other way is how we're gonna do this one. So here's all the pieces again. Oh, incidentally, check this out. Forgot to show this before I moved it. So remember that seam we made? How cool is that? So when this seam gets sanded, or actually when the entire thing gets sanded, that seam is going to look beautiful. So if you crack a piece of veneer, or if you have to make a seam to make a piece wider, if you're with the grain, it's going to look great. Back to this. So what we're going to do is from the front side, I'm going to start putting these pieces in. And I'm going to use what's called a low adhesion tape. This is a frog tape. And I'm going to start putting all the pieces in, no glue. We'll assemble it from the front, pulling everything tight like we want. Then we can flip it over and add glue. Of course, the goal here is to pull all the pieces tight and then put tape across all the seams. It's nearly inevitable that you're going to get a small piece of vulnerable cross grain breaking off. Here between the blue, tan, and white, there's a little triangle that's missing. No big shake. I can simply cut a piece. I'm using a sharp chisel, and then I line up the angle, and I'm just doing this all by eye, right? Sharp chisel to make another seam. So I've got two of the seams cut, again, just by eye. Now, if this crumbles on you, you can put a little bit of glue on the back and that'll hold the piece together. I took a chance and it worked. Add a little bit of glue. A scalpel is excellent because it has a really sharp point. You can stab the piece and set it in place. And that's all there is to it. Fantastic. All right, with this method number 2, we've added tape on the front, a low adhesion tape on the front, and now we can add glue from the back side. And you could just squeegee that in with your fingers, wipe off the excess. But what works even better is the spatula that you have already, and just squeegee that glue within that seam. This works excellent. It also removes the excess. All right, see that gap at the lower left between the black and purple? Yeah, that'll pull quite easily. But instead of just pulling between the black and the purple, I'm going to pull all the way across. And I'm using a Formica sample here that makes an excellent squeegee. And then using a little bit more glue and longer pieces of tape and tighten it up. Yeah, man. That's how you do it. Of course, on the back, you don't need full strips of tape, just enough to get it tight. And you'll notice as you're adding glue and pulling all the seams tight, everything starts to move a little bit. So you can just kind of stop, do sections at a time, weight it down, let it dry for about 30 minutes. And I try not to go more than that because remember, tape is basically paper. And if you immerse it in glue and let it dry overnight, it's going to be hard to remove. Keep in mind, really important to make sure that your pieces don't overlap. If they do, that'll be a problem because the veneers are so thin, you may end up sanding through. In a way, I'm actually glad this happened. I do have an area right there that overlaps slightly. So let me show you how we're going to fix that. Here you can see that it really shows up with a low raking light, right? I've already checked the entire image. This is the only place right there that needs fixed. And so we're going to break that area loose. So I just grabbed a piece of Formica. This is probably, I don't know, 30 thousandths. You could probably use a metal ruler, you know, something thin. And I'm just lining it up with the area that needs to be repaired. I'm going to utilize this seam on my table saw. And I like doing this on a cast iron table because it's so solid. It's going to provide the support we need to bust that loose. So I'm going to add a little bit of tape to hold this motif down so it doesn't shift. And then with this piece of Formica on top, right where I think it would support the best, I can put that in place and add a little mark. Great. Now I can move that piece of Formica underneath, and I know it's going to be in the exact position that I need to offer the support to knock those two pieces loose. So I've got this little dowel, whatever it is. Could have used a block of wood, but the radius seemed to fit that area good. So that pink is the high spot. I give it a tap. Yeah, man, it's that easy. And now it's flush. I can add some more glue, add some tape, so it'll stay flush. Let's fast forward. I've removed all the tape from both sides, and now I can cut this motif to size. And you'll notice when I'm cutting the veneer, I come in from both ends, from both edges. That way it doesn't split out. So now you want to take your assembled image and give it a good scuff on the backside with about 100 grit. All right, so we have our motif. I'm using 1/2 inch Baltic birch, and you'll notice the grain is running vertical on this because predominantly the grain is going horizontal on this piece, and so that will create a balanced panel. Now, the file for the Shaper Origin was created at 20 by 16, but I made everything a little bit big at 21 by 17, and once the veneers are on, I can cut it to size. And yes, we'll add a balance sheet to the back. Whatever you do to the front, you need to do to the back. Of course, it doesn't need to be Marquetry, but we can just put some scrap veneer on the back. Okay, ready to roll. I've got my substrate, Baltic birch, and I decided to use these little bench sawhorses. That way, those will act as cowls and probably get some really good clamping pressure. Couple of long clamps there and there. Of course, all the pieces, more clamps, a couple of outlets. Wait, those aren't anything. Tape, just to hold the sandwich together. I'm gonna be using one of these rollers, and here's a place to put it. I always get a dry paper towel and a wet one ready. I'd rather have it and not need it than have to run to the sink when I do need it, if I need it. Extra tape, so yeah, man, let's do this. Let's glue this. Okay, so what I'm using here is Unibond 1, and it's formulated for veneers. It creates a rigid glue line, and I'm using it because I had some left over, when in fact you could use any Titebond product. This panel is small enough where you shouldn't have any problems. Larger panels, like the recent door I did, should be glued with a rigid type glue. Even epoxy would work, but something that doesn't allow any movement of that veneer. As I mentioned, the smaller panel, Titebond would be fine. And how much glue should you use? This can be a little bit tricky if you don't put enough. Of course, you're not going to get adhesion. You could get bubbles, which I experienced recently. If you put too much, that thin veneer can wrinkle even underneath the cowl. So the proper amount is a full coating, a full wet. The glue needs to be wet when you apply the veneer, and you should be able to see a pencil line drawn on the substrate right through the glue. I think an important aspect of working with veneer is to get it into that bed of glue quickly to create an intimate bond. Of course, normally I would use a vacuum bag, but not everybody has one, so I wanted to show this option. Something that I've always done when I'm doing a glue up, whether it's edge gluing or even a veneer panel like this, is I wait a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes, and then come back and add a little bit more pressure to the clamps. My theory is a lot of clamps and moderate pressure rather than too few of clamps and tons of pressure. One important thing that I need to mention is that your cowls need to have something on them to keep the glue from sticking, right? Here the bottom cowl was plywood. I used clear tape and waxed paper. And on the top piece, I used a piece of melamine and I sprayed it with a mist of top coat. You'll get glue coming through the veneer itself or even migrating through those seams. You may have noticed I used a couple of pieces of cardboard just to bend those cowls and apply more pressure in the center. And bam, that looks amazing. Now, I seriously doubt that too many people will want to use a belt sander on 23 thousandths thick veneer, but I like to live on the edge. Seriously, you could use a DA or an RO sander. Just make sure it has a hard pad and don't linger in one spot too long. Here I started with a 120, finished up with a 180, but you could probably just do the entire thing with 180 and be done. All right, here it is, cut to size, and I'm spraying a waterborne finish, but you could use lacquer, shellac, conversion varnish, poly, wipe-on poly, Osmo. You just need to get some sort of protectant on it, right? And not only does it protect it, it'll also make those colors pop. Haha, and that's it. So we went from this SVG file to this beautiful rendering of this national monument called Shiprock. So now you'll have the knowledge and then the skills to incorporate these thin veneers with the Shaper origin, and it's easy to see this endless array of possibilities. I hope you enjoyed this free video. The files are also free, but hey, head on over to my website, pick up some veneer packs, and let's see what you can create. As always, thanks a ton for watching.